All right, we'll get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man walaha ma ba'd. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All right. So we are continuing with our discussion on the Qadr and what it means, how can we understand it. And we left off here yesterday where if you think about the question that what's the point of doing anything if things have already been written down, right, as you might sometimes hear, then, you know, that question had already been asked to the Prophet ﷺ also, because it's a pretty logical question to ask once you think about what it means for things to have been written down, that things will always happen the way Allah has willed it to happen, the way Allah has written it down. Qadr, essentially. So if a person says, okay, if everything is written down, then why try? Or if everything is set, why try? The Prophet ﷺ said that you should still do your best, you should still act, because you will be facilitated for what you were created for. And that's not something that a person can determine for themselves or guarantee for themselves until they pass away from this world, hopefully in a state of Iman. Right. So one of the most interesting surahs in the Quran in terms of stories are, you know, obviously Surah Yusuf and Surah Kahf, particularly the story of Musa and Khidr alayhi salam. And both Surah Yusuf and the story of Musa and Khidr alayhi salam are very emblematic of what we mean by everything will happen when Allah has willed it to happen. And the will of Allah happens at the best time in the best possible way, even if initially that might not seem to be the case. So if you look at the entire story of Yusuf alayhi salam, every single step of Yusuf alayhi salam's story essentially facilitated the dream that he saw in the very beginning. So his brothers and his family bowing to him out of respect could only happen when he reached a status that would make them do so, right? And Yaqub alayhi salam, of course, says that is being given prophethood and knowledge of the interpretation of dreams. But his brothers, 10 of them out of the 11, Binyamin was younger than him. Binyamin was a full brother. But the other brothers who were very jealous of him, who literally tried to kill him and tried to get rid of him, and they did for a short amount of time, how would they get to the point where they would have to bow down to Yusuf alayhi salam and kind of show him that respect when they are starting off in a place where they are extremely jealous and they are basically saying, let's kill Yusuf because of that, right? So despite the fact that the separation from Yaqub alayhi salam would be extremely difficult on Yaqub alayhi salam, not to mention traumatic for a young child like Yusuf alayhi salam was at that time, right? Most of the Mufassirin say he was about 12 when he was thrown into the well. There are other narrations, but 12 makes the most sense. So even though it was difficult on Yaqub alayhi salam, even though it was traumatic on Yusuf alayhi salam, and he was separated from his family in that way, he was placed in a well where a caravan passed by that picked him up and took him to the place where he needed to be, which was Egypt. All right. And then he was placed in a household where his integrity was tested, and he stood by his morals. Basically, he stood by what was right and went to jail for it, which on the surface, again, seems like, why would this happen to a good person? But he was in a place where he was safe from the continuous temptations, and also the fact that he was in a place where he could essentially showcase his ability of interpreting dreams. And it is in prison that he meets two people, one of whom becomes the future cupbearer of the king. He interprets the dream for the cupbearer, right? That guy gets released, forgets about Yusuf. When does he remember Yusuf? When the king sees the dream, right? So imagine for a second, the cupbearer actually does remember Yusuf alayhi salam when he is released, and he tells the king about a story, and the king says, okay, if he is as you say he is, then I'll set him free. Well, that would move Yusuf alayhi salam away from a position where he could be of service to the king by interpreting the dream. So he was kept in prison, right? He was kept in prison, and then years later, king sees the dream. Cupbearer suddenly remembers that, hey, I know of a person who can interpret this dream for you. Let me go see him. So Yusuf alayhi salam gives the interpretation of the dream, doesn't hold a grudge, doesn't say that, oh, you forgot about me, so I'm not going to give you the interpretation, right? He gives him the interpretation. And then when the king hears the interpretation, what does he say? That, let me meet the guy. I want him in my employee because he seems like a very knowledgeable individual. But now, because of this favor that Yusuf alayhi salam did for the king, he has leverage. He has leverage. He has the ability to ask for something in return, which he would not have had if the cupbearer had made Yusuf's case known to the king when he was first released. But now he has leverage. So what does he do with that leverage? He says, clear my name. Clear my name. I'm here because of false accusations, right? And I'm here to protect the reputation of the Aziz, right? And the king brings the wife of the Aziz and everyone involved, and they all confess that, no, he is a moral person. So the king not only knows that Yusuf alayhi salam is knowledgeable, but he knows that he is a very moral individual. That was literally a job interview. So when Yusuf said, "Ij'alni ala khaza'in al-ard," put me in a responsibility for the treasury, the king had all the information that he needed about him. This was a very moral individual, was very knowledgeable, was suffered in prison because of false accusations, but he kept shut. So Yusuf alayhi salam is now in a position where he has literally more power than the king. He's not a king, but he has more power than the king because he's in control of the food stock during the drought. And lo and behold, who comes in front of him? His brothers, right? And this is a fulfillment of what Allah tells him in the very beginning when he was in the well, that one day you will be able to tell your brothers what they did to you and they wouldn't even know it was you. So it reaches to a point where Yusuf alayhi salam is able to make them realize, obviously, when he says that I am Yusuf and this is my brother and Allah has blessed us, the brothers realize that what they did was ultimately for nothing. 11 years, right? Not 11 years, more than that. Some Mufassirin say that Yusuf alayhi salam met his family again after 80 years. Allah knows best, but again, it's not beyond the realm of probability that it was decades, essentially, right? So he meets his brothers, and his brothers are basically in a position to be punished because he has power over them. He doesn't deny them food. He doesn't deny them, what they need. But when he tells them, they realize that our brother has indeed surpassed us, right? And he has been given the status because of who he is, and it is the mercy of Allah, and they prostrate, right? And that's how the entire family comes to Egypt. So that story, alongside all of the lessons that we can get out of, the study of human character and so on, is also a study of qadr, the fact that everything happens in the way it happens for the reason it needs to happen, right? And only Allah knows best. We are able to perhaps tease out these connections retroactively because we're looking at it later, right? And you realize that, oh, one led to the other, right? So we're not going to look at that one, but we're going to look at the story of Musa and Khidr alayhi salam as a case study for qadr. Okay, so the story is something that all of us know. It's a story that all of us are very aware of. Musa alayhi salam, one time he is asked the background of the story. Musa alayhi salam is asked by his people, who is the most knowledgeable? Or is there someone more knowledgeable than you? And obviously they didn't mean including Allah. They meant amongst the people. Is there anyone more knowledgeable than you? Musa alayhi salam says no. Musa alayhi salam's answer was not incorrect, because he was giving an answer based on his position as a prophet, that I receive revelation, so perhaps I know more than the average person. However, Allah would have perhaps preferred he give another answer, that maybe there's someone more knowledgeable than me, or there could be others more knowledgeable than me, but I am the most knowledgeable with regards to what Allah has revealed. Whatever the case might be, Allah sends Musa alayhi salam to go visit a servant of ours, Abdum min ibadina, who we had given a mercy, ataynahu rahmatan min indina, whom we had given mercy, and we have given him a knowledge from us. So go meet this person. So Musa alayhi salam and a servant of his who is not named in the Quran, but most Mufassirin say he was Yusha bin Nun alayhi salam, who became a prophet after Musa and Harun alayhi salam passed away. And Yusha bin Nun is known as the prophet Joshua, according to the biblical narrations, right? The prophet Joshua and Yusha bin Nun alayhi salam was the one who, with the descendants of the people who lived during the time of Musa alayhi salam, were the ones who actually fought and liberated Quds, and Allah granted them entry. Okay, so Musa alayhi salam and a servant of his, they go on this journey. We all know the incident with the fish, and he meets a person who is known as Khidr or Khadir. Again, he is not named in the Quran, but he is called a servant of Allah. And he pleads with Khidr and he says, let me go on this journey with you. And he says, fine, but you're not going to be able to be patient. And all I ask is you don't ask me any questions. All I ask is you don't ask me any questions. So Musa alayhi salam agrees and he says, okay. So they set off on a journey. They got on a boat to cross a river. And Khidr alayhi salam, out of sight from everyone but Musa, damages the boat. All right. Some say that he, pierced a hole on the hull of the ship, which is the side of the ship, right? Or something, did some damage that would basically make it faulty. Not immediately dangerous, but it could be considered faulty for that. Musa alayhi salam reacts, and this is key. Musa alayhi salam reacts like how any rational person would react when they see something like that. And Musa alayhi salam's position is the position of every reader of the story, which basically is us. Why would you do something like that? It makes no sense. You're in the boat's gonna be damaged. What if the boat starts sinking? You're in the boat, you've jeopardized yourself as well. But the Prophet says, don't ask me any questions. It's like, okay. So they start walking after they disembark, and they come across a boy. Again, the word ghulam is used, but we can assume that it is a boy who has not yet reached maturity, or perhaps who has reached maturity but is still very young. And Khidr kills him. Now, this is, of the three, this is perhaps the most difficult one to understand. Musa alayhi salam again reacts like how any other person would react when they saw murder happen right in front of them, right? Like, what'd you do? Why'd you do this? This makes no sense. What did the child do to you? It's an innocent child. And Khalid says, okay, I told you not to ask me any questions. So he said, okay, one more question, then I'll leave your side. They continue and they get to a village where they ask for hospitality because they are travelers and they are refused hospitality, right? On the way out of the village, they see a wall which is crumbling, which is about to collapse, and Khidr alayhi salam fixes it. Musa alayhi salam says, we could have used that to get some food. We could have said that, hey, we'll fix this wall for you. In return, his name is Yusha bin Nun. And Yusha, the Hebrew version of that name is Joshua, or at least the anglicized version of that name is Joshua, right? So Musa alayhi salam says, well, we could have used this to kind of get some food and some hospitality. Why didn't we do that? And Khidr says, okay, هذا فراق بيني وبينك. We're done. This is where we part ways, but I will tell you what I didn't explain to you before. So we all know the explanation, but again, tie it to why we are looking at this story. On the surface, everything that happened was something that would be considered negative or evil. However, when a person zooms back and we are given more information, you kind of know why it was done for a greater good, which was deemed greater good by Allah, right? Then you realize that, oh, now it makes sense. So, yes, I damaged the boat, but the boat was a source of livelihood for some poor people who were fishermen, basically. And a king was coming that was seizing every workable boat. Okay? That was seizing every workable boat. And I damaged the boat so it wouldn't be taken. Now you could think to yourself that, okay, but it's like a very small damage. It's not like Khidr destroyed half the ship or something. It's just a small hole or some damage that would be visible, but would be now considered defective at most. It could be fixed, perhaps. But keep in mind, if this king is coming and he's like dragging every ship that he could find, he's not going to drag like a faulty boat as well, just because he could fix it. Right? That's the point of seizing. Right? So Khidr alayhi salam says, again, he is acting as an agent of Allah, right? According to most accounts, he is not a prophet. He's not a prophet. So what knowledge he received was a divine inspiration, direct knowledge from Allah, right? And Khidr alayhi salam was acting on behalf of Allah. By all accounts, Khidr alayhi salam was also a human being who was not an angel. So now it makes sense that, okay, this damage happened, but it was to prevent a greater harm, right? Damage happened, but it was to prevent a greater harm. And then the boy, Khidr alayhi said that Allah knows that through the actions and decisions of this child as they grow up, they will become a disbeliever. And the child's parents are believers, they are very pious, and this strain of their child will be extremely difficult on them. The strain of their child will be very, very difficult on them, and perhaps would even cause them to be led astray, right? So this, because, حُبُّ الشَّيْءِ يُعْمِي وَيُصِمْ, as the Prophet ﷺ says in a hadith, that the love of a thing, excessive love of a thing, can blind and deafen a person, right? So is it possible that the child could have led his parents astray also? It's a possibility, but Allah says that the child would definitely have gone astray. Now, consider the two options. The child continues to grow up, but becomes a disbeliever, passes away as a disbeliever, and now is punished for eternity. And the parents' sadness continues for that long period of time, because there's no going back. The other option is the child passes away because of this. He's killed, but he passed away either in a state of innocence because it was before the age of maturity, or he was still young enough that he has not committed any great sin. Passes away in a state of innocence. Allah forgives him. Allah gives him Jannah. The parents, because they are pious, are able to persevere and have sabr, but they are reunited with their child in Jannah, eternal happiness. So on the surface, one seems very, very evil, but the alternative provides the greater good, which again is only known to Allah, right? So Khidr Alayhi says that's what happened. Mufassirin also mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took that child away, but gave them another child for this world, for the world that grew up to be a believer. So they had both children with them in the akhirah, essentially, right? So what would be the greater good? For the third one, Khidr says that underneath the wall, there was a treasure or some wealth left behind by a very pious servant of Allah's for his two orphan children. Why is that important? And why is the detail orphan mentioned, right? A village that denied travelers hospitality, if they were to discover this wealth, this treasure that belonged to two orphans who, mind you, are still young, not able to protect it themselves. If this village discovered this wealth, do you think they would have cared about the rights of an orphan? Most likely not. So what does Allah do? Allah sends Khidr alayhi salam to fix that wall until the point that the orphans grow up and they are able to take control of it themselves and protect it themselves. So again, on the surface, we don't understand why he did what he did, but when the explanation is given, we now have a better picture. So Khidr alayhi salam's explanation clears things up that were not obvious, apparent in any way, shape, or form, based on the actions that he did in the first half of the story. Musa alayhi salam's reaction to every incident is basically a mirror of our reactions, and then how he understood the incidents after he was given the explanation is also how we also understand and react. So the point of the entire story, or one of the points of the entire story, is that our vantage point, our viewpoint, our understanding of why things happen the way they do is very, very limited. We don't know the reason of the vast majority of things. We don't know what the connection is. We don't know what the ultimate good that's going to come out of it. We don't know what it's going to be, right? Allah knows best, which is why we say that. So we cannot definitively say that this was absolutely evil or this was absolutely good, because everything that happens in the world is going to lead to something else, right? Everything leads to something else. Again, we are not given that information, okay? So when it comes to determining whether the qadr of Allah is fair or not, we can't make that judgment simply because we don't have the same type of explanation that Musa alayhi salam was given by Khidr, right? But we can assume, based on some facts about Allah, that Allah is Al-Hakim, all-wise. Allah is Al-Alim, the all-knowing, right? Allah is Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Based on all of that, we could assume and confidently say that everything that happens for the best, even if we have difficulty understanding it or even accepting it. Because Yaqub alayhi salam, for example, when the separation happened between him and Yusuf, he could have said any number of things. And it wasn't just because he was a prophet that he was able to bear it, but because he understood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, caused it for the best of reasons, that it needed to happen in order for Yusuf alayhi salam to reach the status that he would eventually have. Make sense? So sabrun jameel. In the meantime, you have beautiful patience. You try to bear it to the best of your ability. Make sense? All right. Okay. So when it comes to free will, or when it comes to the idea of free will and qadar, like how do you reconcile the two? You basically have two competing positions. All right. I'll post some videos on the Create Class Google Classroom under recommended materials. They are animated videos from Crash Course about this topic. Very interesting to watch. We have two contradictions, and I put contradictions in quotes because both of them are factual for us. These aren't the definitions that are up on the screen. These are basically philosophical definitions. For us, both determinism, which is qadr, things being written or things being determined, is a fact because Allah talks about it, the Prophet ﷺ talks about it, and free will is a fact because we are given that information as well. So we have two positions that on the surface seem to be contradicting each other. Philosophically, these are two contradictory positions. If you're a hard determinist, it's very difficult for you to say that everything that I've done at this point, till this point, has been because of everything that happened before me. And I was unable to do anything otherwise. The problem with like the hard determinist, the problem with 100% determinist position is that how do you judge a person's culpability for something when you are basically saying that when they say that they were bound to do this, like I had to murder this person, there was no other choice, right? We're not talking about self-defense, we're talking about outright murder. So a hard determinist position is the logical outcome if you say that there's no such thing as free will. But that in and of itself doesn't make sense because, again, how do you judge a person's actions, right? Entire fabric of society would tear itself up because there's no sense of responsibility or culpability. You can't hold anybody guilty if somebody can just say, well, I was bound to do this, right? So the diametrically opposite position is free will, which is nothing is determined. Nothing is determined at all. It's all absolute free will. Okay, so just to go through the definition of determinism, all events in the universe, including human decisions and actions, are causally inevitable, not casually, causally inevitable. Just like how there's a sound when I knock on the desk, that's a cause and effect. Everything that happens is inevitable. Determinism entails that in a situation in which a person makes a certain decision or performs a certain action, it is impossible that he or she could have made any other decision or performed any other action. Why did you misbehave in class? I just had to, right? That's sometimes the explanation I'm given by my students, right? But I still take points off of them because there's no such thing. Like you could behave, right? So the opposite is free will. When we say free will, we mean absolute free will with no sense of determinism. So free will, philosophically, is defined as the supposed power or capacity of humans to make decisions or perform actions independently of any prior event or state of the universe, based on the common assumption of individual moral responsibility that underlies the concepts of law, reward, punishment, and incentive. Now, the free will position is the one that is more accepted because it is based on the assumption of moral responsibility. That's how the law is able to be applied to a criminal, because what is usually decided, did they do it willingly, unwillingly? Were they forced to do so? Was it an accident? Was it premeditated? Was it, spontaneous? All of that stuff is to basically judge moral responsibility because every person has the capacity to choose. Now, is it possible, and this is where the middle ground comes in, that suppose that you choose to do something, but you did it because you are genetically bound to do so, right? Or it's something that is part of your character, right? Or if somebody behaves because of a certain type of illness. So, for example, if somebody has hallucinations, schizophrenic, for example, and they act out and they harm someone, that's not going to be considered the same way, because on the surface, you could say that person chose to do it, but they chose to do it based on a determined thing, which was their illness. So you have a middle ground, which is called compatibilism. Compatibilism is basically soft determinism, that there are certain things that are determined, and there's a certain amount of free will that every person has. So on the surface, it would basically look like the effect of something. So the difference that's given in like the video that I'll post is, for example, a person jumps into a pool versus a person being pushed into a pool. Does that make sense? So somebody who's pushed into the pool is basically, they're not choosing to do so, but the effect is the same, that you get wet, you're in the pool, versus jumping in yourself, you are choosing to do so. So on the surface, it still looks the same, but the cause of it is slightly different. So even philosophically, these positions have been debated for a very long time. And ultimately, compatibilism, again, the point of philosophy is to always just philosophize, which means you always find problems. So there's no perfect position in philosophy, essentially, right? So even compatibilism has its own issues, but for us, this is kind of the middle ground that we will look at, right? This is what we're going to look at, because it's a position which takes into account qadr, which takes into account free will, right? So it's a mixture of two, and we try to understand that mix to the best of our ability, okay? Now, when it comes to determinism and free will, traditionally, in our history, we did have basically proponents of absolute free will and proponents of absolute determinism, right? So the Qadariyya were basically an offshoot of, like the mainstream Orthodox Sunni groups, whose basic idea, or at least with regards to this topic, was there was no such thing as qadr, right? They were proponents of absolute free will. Now, what's the problem with saying that there's no such thing as qadr, there's only free will? Ramifications of a belief like that is to say that Allah may know the future, but Allah is not the creator of our future actions, because Allah has pre-eternal knowledge of our actions. Allah has recorded our actions, but when we do them in the future, because we can choose to do as we please, we are quote unquote the creator of our own actions, and Allah's will is not the one that is being manifested. Does that make sense? It's a very, it's a very subtle distinction that that is made, because think back to the stages of qadr that we talked about yesterday, right? Especially number 3 and 4. If you say that Allah knows the future, but you are the one that is controlling your destiny, i.e., you are the one that's going to choose to do as you please, that means it's coming from you and not from Allah. So you are basically the one that is creating your will into existence. You are bringing your own will into existence, but that would make you basically the cause of your own actions. That would make you the creator of your own actions and not from Allah. But everything that we do comes from Allah. So that's one problem. If you take the opposite extreme position, which was the position of the Jabariyya, right? You're going to come across these groups again. inshallah, in year 4, if you are still continuing, inshallah, with Sheikh Mudathir. Right? So the Jabariya are if you want to read up on this, you could read Dr. Sherman Jackson's Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering. That book of his has all of this, right? It's a very dense read, but it's very beneficial. If you want a more historical, viewpoint of it, you could read the Cambridge Handbook of Theology. That's a very good read also. It just kind of looks at the big groups like the rationalists, the determinists, so on and so forth. Okay, so the Jabariya, Jabar means force, right? So basically, these are the proponents of absolute compulsion. Like, I got no choice in doing what I do. Everything comes from Allah, right? Now, the ramifications of such a belief are that creation has no will to do anything and therefore cannot be held accountable for anything. Because if you say, everything I did because Allah forced me to do it, then Allah, who is adil, Allah who is just, can't punish you because you didn't do it of your free will. Does that make sense? The only time punishment makes sense is if somebody chose to do it, right? Somebody chose to do it. So, for example, right, if 2 students are talking in class, right, and one of them is the instigator, right, but I punish both of them the same way or at the same level, that would be unfair, right? Yeah, I can say, like, why were you listening to him, right? Yeah, he's at fault a little bit, but he didn't instigate it, so I can't kind of punish both of them the same way, right? Or somebody who actually did the crime versus an accomplice who was kind of the getaway driver, or somebody who was who just got picked up, right? So again, all of these things, if you just think back to the fact that not everybody might be held accountable for the same reasons, that entire enterprise goes away when you suggest that everyone does everything because they have no choice. All right? So yes, historically, we've had these 2 groups simply because the vast majority Orthodox position is in the middle, that there's a combination of both. All right? Now, if we have 2 contradictions or 2 opposite positions, which are determinist and free will, how do you actually resolve them? Because we can try to fit them to the best of our ability. And the way we do so is not necessarily coming to like a simple, straightforward answer, but we are thinking in light of 2 sets of truths, right? We are thinking in light of 2 sets of truths. We are formulating our answer based on a number of facts. Now, the first set of facts have to do with Allah, which is the qadr side, right? So we know and we believe Allah is omnipotent, which means all-powerful. We talked about this, in lessons 3 and 4. What does it mean to be all-powerful, right? To be all-powerful means Allah is a volitional agent. Allah can do as He pleases, to whom He pleases, when He pleases, and has perfect knowledge, right? That's what we mean all-powerful. Anything less than that is not all-powerful, right? By definition. So when we talk about omnipotence of Allah, we are thinking through the following things. Number 1, Allah's ilm. Allah has perfect pre-eternal knowledge. Pre-eternal knowledge means the knowledge that existed alongside Allah before we were even created, and that includes time. So Allah's perfect pre-eternal knowledge of our destinies. Number 2, kitaba, which is the recording, right? Kitaba, the writing. So Allah knows and Allah writes it. All 4 of these are basically the 4 things that we saw in the very beginning yesterday. The stages of Qadr are four. These four are the stages of Qadr. The first one is the knowledge of Allah. Second one is the recording of that knowledge. Complete detailed recording of the decree of all things. That's recording of knowledge. Number three, Mashiyah. Mashiyah is the will of Allah. The power to determine what will and what will not occur. Right? The power to determine what will and what will not occur. So for example, Allah could cause fire not to burn because that's will. Ibrahim alayhi salam was not harmed by the fire. Why? Even though fire's nature is to burn. But that's the will of Allah that determined that the burning quality of that fire will not be there. We can't do that. We can't do that because for us, we are bound to the cause and effect of the stuff around us. Right? So say, for example, if you want to, just to keep it simple, if you want fire not to burn, then we have to use something else. We can't use fire and expect not to get burned. Or, for example, we can't stand in the rain without anything on top of us and expect not to get wet. Right? Because we're bound by cause and effect. Allah is the one that can decide how every cause, right, produces its effect. So a cause like fire may produce its effect, which is to burn, or may not produce its effect, which is to not burn. Are you guys following? That's Mashiach. That's the power to determine what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. Lastly, the will of Allah coming into existence, which is what we call khalq. Khalq, the power to bring anything into existence, including our actions and their outcomes. Okay? So the distinction between the two can be understood by our own limitations. You might have the will to do something, right? But you might not be able to bring it into existence. So a bit of a downer example, but think of all of the protests that everyone around the world has been doing for the last year because of Gaza. That's will. But it hasn't come to fruition like how we wish it would have, right? Because we're not able to produce direct outcomes of our will. Okay? We're not able to produce direct outcomes of our will because we are bound by cause and effect. This is similar to, and this used to happen in madrasa. So say, for example, like sometimes, in the exam hall, we'd be sitting and some students will be like, kind of looking at the ceiling. And sometimes our teachers would say, this person is waiting for wahi. He's waiting for Jibreel to come down and give him the answers, right? So the difference between Mashiyah and Khalq is you want to pass the test, but you haven't studied for it. You can't manifest it into existence, literally, right? Like you can make all the du'as, Rabbi shrah li sadri, you're not going to have kashf all of a sudden, right? If you've not studied, not taken a lick of notes, nothing, right? And you're now faced with the exam and you're like, just, randomly, whatever, whatever. So you can't produce something that you want because the cause of passing, which is knowing the contents of the exam, is not there. Does that make sense? We are bound by cause and effect. Allah is not. So that's the first set of truths, first set of facts that has to do with omnipotence of Allah, and that's the qadr side. The free will side, for us, we have two things. First one is the free will position. The people who say that there is such thing as free will, even philosophically, they base it on the idea of moral responsibility. They base it on the idea of moral responsibility, that every person has the capacity to choose as they wish. And this is what Allah expects a person to do. when Allah sends the prophets, when Allah sends miracles, when Allah sends messengers, when Allah gives people the capacity to understand revelation and to see the truth with their own eyes in the creation and elsewhere, a person is given basic moral responsibility to decide to follow it. And that is coupled with what we call irada. Irada simply means Allah has also given us the ability to act voluntarily. So not just the idea of moral responsibility, but we also have the ability, and this is what we call free will, that a person has the ability to act voluntarily. So the alarm goes off, you hit the snooze button, and that split second you have a choice of getting out of bed or not and praying Fajr. Right? So, if you're snoozing, some people are like a one alarm person, right? Others are like alarms every 5 minutes, right? Which is, it's like every 5 minutes the alarm is going off. Sometimes it's helpful, right? But every time you hit the snooze button, you're choosing to hit the snooze button, right? But then you have a choice to make. Do you go back to sleep or do you get out of bed? Okay, so that's what we call irada. So both combined is what Allah is going to judge a person's, is what a person is going to be judged on. Okay, so again, I said in the very beginning when we started this yesterday that qadar is not something that a person will have a perfect, intellectually satisfying answer to. Intellectually or emotionally satisfying answer. Because at some point, a person has to say, I trust literally in the qadr of Allah. I trust in the knowledge of Allah, in the wisdom of Allah, and so on. Okay. So that kind of wraps up the qadr side of it, right? There isn't a straightforward answer. We are in a middle position where we are trying to basically consolidate, combine two sets of facts, right? And at the end of the day, as the Prophet ﷺ said, when he was asked the same question, why do anything if things have already been determined? The Prophet said, well, you don't know. You should act. And Allah will make easy for you what He has created you for. Allah will facilitate for you, which we cannot say with a guarantee that it's either or. So a person just has to do and continuously make dua to Allah, right? Now, there's a secondary question that comes up in relation to qadr, but it's not, part of qadr per se, but it's a very common question today that you might hear, especially as like a rebuttal type of question from atheists or people who question the existence of, a creator, which is called the problem of evil. That if things are determined, which is qadr, then why does Allah allow, or why does God allow evil to happen to good people? Right? It's what we call the problem of evil, right? The problem of evil. So it might, it's not contradictory for us. We just don't know how it works, right? But, fire not burning seems to be a contradiction, but Allah makes it happen, right? So free will and qadr working in a way in tandem according to the justice, mercy, and knowledge of Allah also happens in a way that we don't understand, right? So the problem of evil is basically, if God exists, why is there evil in the world, right? So this is, this is a proposition that sometimes you'll hear, that if God is all good, then He's not all powerful. If He's all powerful, then He's not all good, right? And the assumption of those two statements is that if God is all good, that means He is basically giving up some of His power, or He is, because if you say God is all good and evil things happen, that means He's not all powerful because He didn't prevent all evil things from happening, right? If you say He's all powerful, which means that He has prevented all evil things from happening, that means He is not all good, right? So it's it seems like a very complex proposition on the surface, but it's really not. All right, because again, it comes down to how do you think of evil, right? How do you define evil for starters, and then how do you consider your position vis-a-vis your creator, vis-a-vis Allah, and then how do you account for free will within that whole proposition, right? Because that entire question or that proposition of if there's evil in the world, why doesn't God prevent it, excludes the idea of free will or doesn't take into account evil that's done out of free will, right? So for us, it's not a very difficult thing to understand, but we have to appreciate the fact that it is a question that can cause a lot of doubts for people, especially when they don't understand the basics in a good way or in a correct way. And especially people who do want to understand why is there injustice in the world, right? So when we talk about evil, when we talk about what's wrong or bad, first of all, we don't say that it comes from another source. We don't have this idea of being of Allah being only the source of good and shaitan being the source of evil, because our belief of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah is that both good and evil are creations of Allah, right? Allah is the creator of all things, right? However, we directly attribute the good to Allah and the bad to ourselves as a matter of etiquette, like Ibrahim alayhi salam did. When Ibrahim alayhi salam was talking about Allah, he said, He is the one who gives me life, He is the one who gives me death, and when I fall sick, He's the one who cures me. But that wasn't, he didn't mean to say that Allah has no place, or Allah has no say in me falling sick. No, that also comes from Allah, but as a matter of etiquette, we don't attribute it to Allah directly. Now, when we think about doing evil things, when we talk about doing evil things, the nature or the natural state of a human being in accordance with their state of fitrah is good, right? Children are perfect case studies of this. Children don't have biases, prejudices, right? They don't have these learned behaviors that we pick up as we grow older. They're very innocent, right? That's literally the fitrah shining through, right? So is it possible that there's there's a devilish child, like, right? Is it possible? Yeah, sure. But you don't condemn a child for that, right? The point is that our fitrah inclines us towards good, which is why when a person does something good, they feel good about themselves because it's in line with their fitrah, right? The opposite is when we commit a sin, we feel bad because it went against our fitrah. Because a sin means disobedience to Allah. Fitrah is to obey Allah. Does that make sense? So when you do something, it violates your fitrah. And that causes, feelings of shame and guilt and so on, right? Now, in order to determine, we talked about this when we were talking about the necessity of guidance and prophets and so on, that we are not capable of being objectively moral, right? Objective morality is not possible by human beings because we are always biased, prejudiced, we have our own, viewpoints and so on. So how do we define what's good and evil, right? We determine everything that's good as whatever is pleasing to Allah, and whatever is pleasing to Allah is going to be beneficial for us, even if we don't understand it as such. Make sense? So waking up for Fajr and missing out on an extra hour of sleep, how does it benefit of Allah? How does it benefit Allah? No way, because it doesn't. But it benefits us, even if we don't understand how. Right? How is my giving 2.5% of zakah, right, every year, if I have enough money, how is that beneficial to Allah? It's not. It's beneficial to me even if we don't understand it, you might say, well, how's it beneficial when you're actually subtracting wealth, right? I could understand the social utility of it, but that could be done with any other amount. Why 2.5% specifically? Does that make sense? So on the flip side, evil is therefore whatever is displeasing to Allah, right? My listening to music, or my committing zina, or my drinking alcohol, how does that affect Allah? It doesn't, but affects me, even if I don't understand the effects of it. Even if I see it as beneficial, even if I see it as pleasurable, right? Even if there's literally no harm attached to it, ultimately, because Allah has deemed it wrong and Allah is displeased with it, it is harmful for us even if we don't understand. Right? Are you guys following? So when we talk about good and evil, for us, it's not that simple because, again, you're taking qadr into account. Everything that happens for a reason. Okay? Everything that happens for a reason. So we don't know how something that happens now leads to a greater good later. And ultimately, the capacity to do both good and evil was created within us by Allah. Allah gave us the capacity to do both good and wrong. And that's the test, right? The test is you have the information and the capacity to do both. You have knowledge of the consequences of doing evil. You have knowledge of the rewards of doing good. Does that make sense? So which one will you choose to do? That's where irada comes into play. That's where moral responsibility comes into play. Okay. Now, when it comes to good and evil, again, some of this is a summarization of what we talked about previously. Good and evil are determined through revelation, because there's no way for us to determine, based on our assumptions, our understanding, what is actually good or wrong. Because many things are considered right, even though they are actually wrong, because they are in line with other thoughts, right? So when it comes to Enlightenment philosophy, post-Enlightenment philosophy, right, starting from like Rousseau and so on, the idea of, authenticating your feelings and giving truth to your feelings and acting as you please, total autonomy, right? All of these positions basically are the drivers behind why so much of what we see around us happening makes absolute perfect sense. Why can you one day decide that I'm going to change my gender and I'm going to suddenly be a completely different person because I'm giving truth to my feelings, right? And your feelings are an intrinsic part of you and part of your identity. And if you deny it, you are denying a part of yourself, right? We're familiar with all of these arguments, but for the liberal person who takes that viewpoint, it makes perfect sense to them because they're basing it on the idea of, what I feel is an authentic part of myself and not necessarily shahawat, not necessarily desires, right? From our position, we are going to say differently because no, it's not about what you feel. It's about you resisting your nafs. It's about resisting shaitan. It's about resisting your environment, your society, and doing what is pleasing to Allah. So we are able to determine good and evil through revelation. Now, why can't you say good is something is good because it's good, like in and of itself? Like, why can't we determine something intrinsically being good? Because then you are holding Allah to your own standard. Does that make sense? Like if we had to say that this is good, right, and we understand why it's good, and Allah hasn't said it's good, then for you to say that this is actually good, you have to believe that Allah knows that Allah's sense of morality is lesser than yours. We might not say that out loud, but this is kind of the problematic position that people run into when they say it's unfair of Allah to punish people for eternity because of shirk. Right? Because you are holding Allah to a standard of justice which is yours. Because Allah's standard of justice is believe and you will be in Jannah. Don't believe and you will be punished for eternity. And Allah has the capacity and the free will to do as He pleases. And He has made it very clear what His expectations are. So if a person says that, oh, it's unfair, I don't believe the mercy of Allah is such. I believe the mercy of Allah is that, He will forgive everyone. We talked about this already, right? So if you say only the mercy of Allah, you have to also take into account the other attributes of Allah. And if Allah has said that this is what He will do, and you say that that's wrong or that's unfair, and Allah says He is not going to wrong anyone, and no one will be oppressed, and Allah is just, then which standard do you take? Are you guys following? So everything that we determine and how we are able to determine it also comes from Allah. So anything that Allah says is good, we say is good. Okay? This is even something that you find in Socratic dialogue. Basically, it's again a philosophical question also. Like, how do you determine something being good? Okay? So, it's obviously a shirky quote, right? But it's directly from the dialogue. So is the pious as in good, right? So is the good loved by the gods because it is good? Or is it good because it is loved by the gods? Like, which is it? Okay? Because one assumes that it's intrinsically in and of itself, which gives it a stamp of approval, versus the other way around, which is because it is given a stamp of approval, it is taken as good. Does that make sense? So again, anything that we consider good or evil is directly from Allah, because Allah has said it as such. Now, which means something that is evil can turn out to be good in terms of the larger picture, and vice versa, as we saw in the story of Musa and Khidr alayhi salam, right? And something evil can turn out to be good in terms of the larger picture is how we can think of the problem of evil question in one way. Okay, so what's different about this, continuous year-long, bombardment of Gaza, even though it's been happening, right, sporadically, periodically, right? What's different about this one? It's the fact that it's live streamed, it's on social media, right? The sources of information are decentralized, to use a fancy term. Simply means not everybody's looking at CNN, not everybody's looking at Fox. People are going to the internet, right? There are people on the ground who have become reporters, volunteer reporters, right? And who are showing facts and reality on the ground. And people are able to see, like, the State Department stuff. They're able to see the Israeli propaganda, and they're able to see reality as it is. And they are able to now, perhaps they're starting to think beyond, even if it's in other ways, like why send foreign aid when we can put it to our schools? Why send foreign aid when we can put it to our healthcare and so on? You have to attract people in different ways, but people are questioning the narrative. So was this possible previously? No. It's only happening the way it is happening now because of the time itself, right? Now, we know that the world gets to a point where you have basically sides drawn, right? Side of the Mahdi, the side of Dajjal. And in order for the world to be in literally two parts, right, into two groups, circumstances need to force people to each side, which means the people who had the facade of civility, the facade of being civilized and so on, the masks are coming off rapidly, right? Unashamedly, right? Everything's being, openly said and, loudly and proudly being said. And inevitably, this is drawing sides, like, believe it or not, right? So for every person who passes away, we know what the status of the shuhada are. Like, we don't have to worry about them because Allah says, they are alive, right? We don't have to worry about them. This is just a test, and they have passed the test. They're on the greatest of ranks, even though it's difficult for us to understand and swallow, especially for people who have it happening to their family members, right? But what brings comfort in a time like this is we don't look at the evil, we look at the justice of Allah. We look at the mercy of Allah. We look at everything as a way of, like every single person who you might see on a video clip, for example, right? Or you might see in pictures, like every nurse, doctor, healthcare worker, ambulance driver, journalist, like the people literally on the ground, like, the average citizen that is pulling bodies out of the rubble, right? You look at them and, astaghfirullah, somebody might say, well, they don't have a beard, they don't have a long beard, or, they don't look pious, whatever our conceptions of piety might be. But would you and I be able to see the test through with their strength? We wouldn't. Maybe that's the mercy of Allah that we're not put in that position, right? So the ranks of every one of those individuals is much higher than ours, guaranteed. Allah knows best, but we could be very, certain that they have a high rank by Allah, right? Every person that has passed away, we know what their status is in Jannah, right? And the good that comes out of it is the hearts and minds are changing of a population that probably couldn't think beyond political talking points a year ago. Okay? And again, things change very, very gradually. And sometimes it happens rapidly, but it happens rapidly because things have been building up. Things don't change overnight. People get frustrated and they say, like, why are people still being stubborn? Why are, because again, just like how you have the capacity to care, people also have the capacity to not care, right? And, Allah has said that it will get to a point for people that shaitan will beautify their actions for them, right? Which means they won't be able to see the wrong that they're doing. Like you find some of these, Israeli officials on social media, and you wonder, like, how is it possible for a person to be so full of hate? Like, if you look at Ben Gvir and like Smotrich and that settler crazy lady Daniela Weiss, right? Who's like, we will resettle Gaza, and then like you listen to that and you're like, or every single person who, for example, attended a real estate event in a synagogue in Jersey that was selling plots of land in Gaza that still have rubble. Can you imagine the callousness of like somebody who is able to, in a house of worship, right? You go and you're like, I'm gonna bid on a piece of land so we gotta have a beachfront property in Gaza where there's still rubble, right? It's like it's mind-blowing, but it's only mind-blowing for people who have a sense of conscience, right? So that's, like, yeah, a person can, rail about problem of evil and all that, but you could very easily say, okay, where is human accountability or free will or moral responsibility in this equation? Do people not have the choice to decide what's right and wrong? Why pin everything on God? Because if you think of everything evil happening and Allah not preventing it as wrong, then the question to like kind of counteract that is, well, how much of the evil that's happening is a result of free will? How much of it is a result of people wanting to do as they please? So you can't, because if you just pin everything on Allah or you pin everything on God, it's trying to excuse your own behavior. Like we literally have no choice or we have no capacity or capability of preventing evil. It's all God's job, right? But that's not how the world works, because how else is Allah going to hold a person accountable? It's going to be based on their actions, is going to be based on their choices. If Allah had to intervene every time somebody tried to do something evil, how would that person be held accountable? Does that make sense? So why does this question come about? Right? Like why is it possible for a person to say that if there is a God, then there would have been no evil, right? And this is someone who might believe in free will, but if you were to say, there's an all-powerful, all-good creator, all-knowing creator, then they will say, well, what about the child that's being shot? What about this, that? Where's God there? Right? You watch some of these, like in the early mid-2000s, the four horsemen of the new wave atheism movement, right? Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, and there was a fourth one, I forgot. Right. You kind of listen to like Hitchens in particular, right? Like subhanAllah, like obviously he's dead now, right? But you kind of hear the arrogance of like, of dismissing the very idea because, for whatever reason, and one of them is, if there was a God, then why is there so much misery in the world? Well, who caused the misery? Right? Are people living in slums because they choose to? Are people struggling to put food on the table because they choose to? Or is it greed? Right? Or, is it a lust of power, a lust of resources that are causing constant war? If every war in the world had to stop today, like the stock prices of like Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and all of these big fat companies that are literally making billions off of weaponry, what would happen? Do you think they would allow it? Do you think there isn't a vested interest in constantly seeing war? And not just for financial reasons, for just power, right? Why care? Why try to maintain like a quote unquote police presence all across the globe by your bases and so on, right? Because it's all a fight of resources, always trying to dominate other countries, other alliances, and so on, right? All of us are very, very aware of this. So you can't say, oh, this person is choosing to be in that position, right? Why is there misery in the world? Why isn't there healthcare? Because healthcare industries are a scam. Like, I'm sorry if there's any doctors, on the call, but you got to admit that the healthcare system is absolutely not fair, right? And if you're kind of just gonna like brush it off as, oh, it's socialism and right, like providing free healthcare socialism, right? What's wrong with it? What's wrong with a little socialism, right? But we it's like the American, so much of what politicians or what so much you hear is so much contradict, or it has to be in line with the myth of America. Like you got to you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you got to be a self-made man, and you got to everything is on the person, right? Literally. And this only works if everything else works. But when you have companies that are charging, I literally read an article like last night, I think, this 2-year-old child in San Diego was bitten by a rattlesnake, right? They had to go to like 2 hospitals because not every hospital carries like antivenom, right? The child, obviously, had to, survived and, was a recovery process, lost some nerves in his right hand and so on. The family got a bill of over 200,000. 200,000. I kid you not. Look it up. And in the article itself, it said the anti-venom itself was over 200,000. The rest of it was just administrative health costs. Right? Now, nobody's denying the benefit of anti-venom, but at the same time, who's making money off of it? When you have hospitals that are run for profit, right? And, sometimes you get charged for like the smallest of things, like $100, $200. And you think to yourself, like, it's a business. Like, you literally can't afford to be sick in America. That's the reality for majority of the people. Right? It's you think to yourself that when people are frustrated at like something like this, you're being frustrated at the wrong thing. It's the companies that are gouging all across the board. And, it's literally the last point before we actually get back to class. It's literally the only place where you will walk in without knowing how much you're going to pay. Think about it. Nowhere else, anywhere, will you have this much, like, lack of information. Like, you literally don't know how much your insurance is going to cover, even though you might have like a really good plan and all that. You don't know how much is going to be covered. You don't know how much you're going to be saddled with. You don't know how much the hospital is going to charge, right? And sometimes months later, you get a charge for what? You're like, I thought I was done with it, right? I thought I paid the copay and, I thought the insurance took care of it, whatever. But the reality is that when people get frustrated at like problems of the world and they, say that, oh, it's all God's fault. Well, what are you all doing? What's everyone else doing? Right? Everything around us, we can blame it on qadr, but we also have to say that everything up until this point has been also because people chose to do things in every step of the way, right? In a way that definitely just led to more and more problems, right? So the problem of evil comes because there is a problem with how we think about this. The root cause of it is misunderstanding qadr in relation to evil, right? And we misunderstand it because of our assumptions. So we have two facts. Fact one, Allah is all-knowing, all good, and all-powerful. Okay, that's fact one. We believe that because part of the attributes of Allah. Fact two, evil exists. That's clear around the world. Now, our assumptions, and I kind of bolded the words that are part of the assumption, that because Allah is all-knowing, all good, and all-powerful, Allah must prevent all evil. Must as in has to. Does that make sense? Allah has to prevent all evil just because He is all-knowing, all good, and all-powerful. However, evil does exist, which means it's not prevented. So you are left with the wrong idea that Allah might not be all-knowing, all good, and all-powerful. But that's wrong. Because when we say that Allah is all-powerful, we mean Allah is not reactionary. That's what all-powerful means. Allah does not have to react to everything that we do. Right? Allah does not have to react to everything that we do. That's what all-powerful means. So the evil anyone suffers for any reason does not get immediately removed or prevented. It's one of the reasons why when we make dua and when we don't see immediate results, you can't say Allah is not all-powerful or Allah is not all-hearing. Well, Allah doesn't have to give you everything as soon as you ask for it. It's going to come to you in a time that He deems it best. So Allah is all-powerful because He does not have to react to what we want. Now, Allah is all good and all-knowing. And this is the wisdom behind experiencing difficulties. which is only known to Allah. We don't know why things happen the way they do. But what we do know is Allah knows best and Allah has infinite knowledge. That's what all knowing means. Allah knows why everything happens the way it does. And we don't have that information. So something that starts off as good. So take the anti-venom thing, for example. The anti-venom is made from venom, right? Anti-venom is from venom, right? Vaccines are developed by a little bit of the virus that they're trying to prevent or inoculate you against, correct? So it starts off from a bad place, but it's for a good thing. Okay. For a child who's being, force-fed medication, that's the evil. But you're doing it for a good cause, right? Even if they don't understand it as such, right? So from the perspective of a believer, there's always good. There's always good. There's always khair. The Prophet ﷺ said that the matter of a believer is amazing because if good happens to them and they are thankful, that's good for them. If evil happens to them and they are patient, then that's good for them. So our perspective and our trust in Allah is what allows a person to see through this issue, that it's not as, simplistic as you make it to be. And ultimately, as I said, anyone who kind of tries to come up with this type of thinking is minimizing or wholesale excluding human will. You're not putting yourself in the equation. You're not thinking what everyone else is choosing to do, right? Every single person who has the capacity to stop everything that's happening today, like negatively, they have the ability, but they don't, because for whatever reason. So you can't pin it on Allah and just be like, why is Allah allowing everything to happen, right? So ultimately, when it comes to both qadr and the problem of evil, which is like a side note type of thing that I just tacked on, we have what we call Islamic theodicy, right? So theodicy basically is how this is found even in Christian theology as well. Theodicy simply means, how do you reconcile the existence of evil and the idea that God is all knowing and all powerful? Does that make sense? How do you reconcile the two? So our version of theodicy, in order for us to combine the existence of evil and Allah's knowledge and power, that obviously includes qadr and everything, it revolves around the following. It's not a straight answer, but it revolves around the following. Number one, limitations of human perspective. We saw this in the story of Musa and Khidr. We don't have all the information. We see the pixel, Allah sees the picture, right? So we don't know why things are happening. Perhaps it leads to a far greater good. Number two, we cannot think of qadr without free will. And free will is necessary. Why? Because that's how Allah will hold every person accountable. That's how we hold each other accountable in this world. That's how the very fabric of law and justice operates in society, the idea of moral responsibility. Now, is it possible that your defense attorney will come and say, like, Your Honor, this person, he's not fit to stand for trial, or blah blah blah, yeah, sure. But the reason why the theory of law and justice can even operate is because you assume free will. Does that make sense? So we cannot exclude this component when we think about qadr, when we think about the existence of evil. Number three, Allah's perfect attributes. Everything that happens is not an indictment against Allah, it's an indictment on us. Literally, because we are the ones that are choosing to continue the harm. We are the ones that are choosing to continuously perpetuate what is wrong. Number four, for the believer, we have trust in Allah. Complete trust in Allah, tawakkul on Allah. right? Tawakkul on Allah simply means that you do your best and you leave the rest to Allah, right? Allah is sufficient for us because of that. Number five, we believe in the significance of eternal reward. Every difficulty that a person goes through is a way of their sins being forgiven, is a way of their status being elevated, is a way of so on and so forth, right? There's a reward attached to difficulty, perseverance through difficulty, and so on. And ultimately, for us, we believe that the world itself was always meant to be a world of tribulation. This world was always meant to have problems because Jannah doesn't have problems, which means this world is going to have problems, right? So the nature of this world, the nature of the life of this world is that it's going to have difficulties, it's going to have trials, right? And this is something that is guaranteed by Allah in the Quran. It's guaranteed by Allah in the Quran. And we kind of combine all of this in order to bring ourselves to a place where we could say, Hasbunallah, or we believe in the qadr of Allah and leave it at that, right? Again, I mentioned it over and over. There's always going to be questions. You could always think about counter questions, right? You could always think about other variations. We simply don't have all the information, right? And at the end of the day, we have enough to make an informed decision, essentially, right? Everything that we did, everything that we went over, basically allows us to make an informed decision of this, have a mindset that allows a person to navigate all of the potential problems and tests of this world in a way that is pleasing to Allah. So that concludes lesson number 9. I'll post the slides in a bit. And we have one more, inshallah, for Creed next week, inshallah, on Thursday. If we, again, finish slightly earlier for fiqh, we're going to get started with the Creed class. Otherwise, we'll just do it on Friday. And the last one is short. It's more or less secondary issues that come up within Creed. It's not to do with the articles directly, which we're done with. And inshallah, next Friday will be the last Creed class. So no more Friday classes. Material is always being added. So eventually this class actually might be 12, 15 weeks, hopefully, adding stuff. There's no point rushing through it, but inshallah, you guys will have a little bit of a break until we restart Friday classes in January, inshallah. So the question is that when we acknowledge that Allah is all powerful and we understand the true nature of qadr, which perspective is more appropriate for earning Allah's pleasure? So there are basically two options. We make dua for a life, opportunities, and capacity that grants us the highest share of Allah's pleasure afforded to us. Or number two, we make dua that in Allah's perfect decree, we hope to accomplish our trials in the best way. It'll be both, right? Because there's nothing that prevents a person from for asking for the best, which is what رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ is about, right? You ask for the best in this world, and the word hasana is nakira. You guys have nakira and ma'rifa, right? So it has a tanween. It's indefinite, which means any good. All good and any good. The good that we understand is good, the good that Allah only knows as good, we want all of it. And we want all the good in the hereafter as well. And of course, the greatest good in the akhirah is Jannah, right? So we can always make dua for the best of everything, right? However, at the same time, we can also make dua that, oh Allah, give us contentment with your qadr, give us contentment with what you have given for us, give us the ability to persevere and continuously ask for good, right? Again, a person doesn't have to make just one of the two du'as. It could be both, right? And it's something that Again, Allah will facilitate for a person and grant a person whatever is decreed for them. All right. Jazakallah. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.